A lot of us have heard the stereotypical boomer phrase, when I was growing up, men were men and women were women, as to point out the fact that gender roles today are a lot less traditional than they used to be. That meaning that the line between male and female has become a lot more blurry because what is acceptable socially for men and women to engage in has changed. However, where I grew up, it was not that progressive. In fact, it was quite backwards in a number of ways, because where I grew up, men were men and women were women. In particular, men were not allowed to show emotions where I grew up. Just about the only emotion that men were allowed to show was anger, and anything else was basically just tangentially related to anger, like a subset of that same emotion. And then leadership and logic. That's all you could show. You couldn't show tenderness, sadness. You definitely couldn't cry. And I know that one was violently suppressed in me. And those were the kind of guys that I was around. The women, on the other hand, they had their own host of problems because of how backwards this place I grew up in the rural South was. But the women at least felt more human in my estimation. I saw them, and those women could feel a much wider range of emotions than the men could. A range of emotions that I saw myself feeling because I was a human. And probably all those men that I was around were feeling those things too, but they had it violently suppressed in them, so we never saw it. And so I developed this perception of women as being uniquely human, or rather, having a greater amount of emotional freedom. And I felt like that was missing in my life. And I believe these were observations that I made fairly early on, because these conceptions of gender were applied to me fairly early on. I liked having long hair not because I knew what gender was, but because I liked having long hair. And when I was insulted, bullied, berated, and fought for that fact, there was a part of me that wanted to be a girl just on account of the fact that they could have long hair. Not to mention the fact that when I showed any emotion that once again was not anger, I had that same response that I got for the long hair, sometimes even worse. Being called a faggot all the time as a kid, or a girl as an insult, without even really knowing what those two things are, because you're not developed enough to have a conception of them, I think it does some real damage to how you see yourself in the world around you. And I never stopped being a sensitive kid, or now as an adult, a sensitive adult, but it certainly fractured my psyche and how I viewed the opposite sex. Case in point, when I went into school, while these gender roles were a little bit more equalized, you know, because I was homeschooled prior to going into public school when I was around 12, it was a little bit better, but it wasn't a lot better. And I saw the kinds of conversations that the girls were having and the kinds of things that they got to do, and I felt like they had more freedom because I could never see the boys doing those things. And more often than not, I found myself either wanting to be able to do both and to have the genders mingle together and be all in the same spot, or I wanted to go over there where the girls were because it felt like society was being a hell of a lot less harsh to them. To me, it seemed like they had life on easy mode because they didn't have all the expectations placed on them that I had placed on me. And I think these early years of my life were where a lot of my quote-unquote gender dysphoria came from. Of course, I don't have that anymore, but I thought I did at a certain point and up to a certain point. If we go back a little bit further from my school years, there was a lot of feminine toys that I was interested in, at the same time that I was interested in masculine toys. And of course I was told, you can only have one or the other. And so what I attempted to do with the masculine toys that were the only option to me, was I would try to play with them in this more maternal way that I saw girls playing with their toys in. Of course, I wanted both. I didn't want one or the other, I wanted both. And this was another area where I felt like my freedom was being restricted. Of course, I didn't have the terms to articulate that at the time, but that's how it felt. And now in retrospect, I know exactly what the problem was. It wasn't that I wanted to be a girl, nor was it that I wanted to be a man. It was that I wanted to be neither. And if I look back on my time identifying as a woman and dressing as a woman, having female hormones course through my body for about a year, and the various developments that came with that, I found myself far, far more uncomfortable with myself and with the world around me than I ever was identifying as male. And this was a staunch reality for me to take in, because I was deeply uncomfortable being male as well, and the expectations that came with that and the presentation that came with that. And so, as I found myself feeling dysphoric in both of these categories, being treated as both of these categories at different times, what I came to realize was perhaps neither category fits me. Perhaps neither apply to me. Perhaps I don't want either to apply to me, that I am male but not a man. That, of course, referring to my sex but not my gender. But that doesn't mean I'm female. It means I would prefer not to. I think part of the reason why I was initially so convinced that I was a girl when I talked about these experiences with gender with trans people online was because they had a pre-established narrative surrounding gender that applied to themselves. Now, these people were primarily people who came from urban environments as well, where essentialistic conceptions of gender like the ones that were imposed on me are basically non-existent. But they were hearing the things that I was saying, and instead of suggesting to me that I could have been dealing with some kind of non-binary dysphoria, or perhaps just discomfort with those rigid conceptions of gender and the abuse that stemmed from them, they seemed to suggest that I was transgender. And I knew that I was really, really attracted to transgender people sexually. I had been since I was like 13, 14. And then when I started getting trans friends in my early teens, like, I became really attracted to them. I started having all of these sexual fantasies about, like, fucking my trans friends and these sorts of things. And so I thought, maybe because I have such a strong sexual preference for these people, one that I didn't really understand and was kind of ashamed of, I began to think, like, maybe it's me actually just wanting to be one. And part of me thought, like, oh yeah, that would be kind of hot, right, if I were one of these hot transgender girls. And so that was a component to why I initially thought I was trans. Of course, when I got on hormones and I actually started having sex, it was a very, very uncomfortable experience that made me feel outside of myself, outside of my body, and so on. When I started having sex as a male and also as a non-binary person, it was way, way more comfortable for me. And so there I came to find out that it wasn't me being attracted to myself or the idea of myself being a trans woman. It was just me being attracted to trans women. But because I had these early childhood experiences, these trans friends of mine were really pushing it on me, this narrative that I was one of them, because there was a lot of projection there. And if I were to push back on it or suggest that that wasn't me or wasn't how I felt, I think there was some innate insecurity there from them, because they felt uncomfortable perhaps questioning their own gender identity. And you can sort of understand why, given the fact that this is a world and a country that is deeply opposed to the idea of this kind of gender nonconformity. So you can understand with that history of trauma why they would not be so comfortable questioning themselves in that regard. They've probably already questioned themselves a lot in that regard. And to hear from me, someone that they see themselves in, hey, maybe this thing isn't as sure as you think it is, would be an uncomfortable experience. So I understand, and I certainly wouldn't call it quote-unquote grooming or anything of that nature. I would call it a simple misunderstanding. But because of this simple misunderstanding amongst some of my friends, I came to be a lot more confused about my gender identity and my position in society because I didn't really have the context for what being female would be like. I mean, I was online, and online gender roles are treated in a very specific way, especially in LGBT communities, that does not really apply to reality. Like, being a woman in a trans Discord server and being a woman on a bus talking to a stranger are two very different dynamics. Not to say that either one is more valid than the other, but they don't translate that easily into each other, you know? Like, they're not the most directly applicable situations, to say the least. And so I was in my room, terminally online, talking to these people, and living out a version of myself that I thought was really, really real. But as I came to put the clothes on, to do up my hair, and to take the hormones for several months, ultimately a little bit more than a year, and I actually lived as that person, doing voice training as well. I put in a lot of effort to speak feminine, to even change my choice of words. It was like I fundamentally restructured myself from the bottom up in order to live as a woman. And I was more dysphoric than I ever was living this way. It was just a deeply disorienting thing that caused me to be suicidally depressed every day throughout most of the day, and caused more discomfort with my body and with myself than I ever had. Like, I really cannot understate just how terrible I felt during that time. And so I got off of those hormones like way later than I should have, because by the time I began realizing that this really wasn't for me, it wasn't that long into me transitioning. Like, I already had some thoughts about this before I got on hormones, but I wanted to ride it out and see how I would feel when I got on them. I get on them, and it's just hell. And I know that it's hell after like 2 months of being on them. I want to get off of them. But I had another motivation for transitioning by the time that I started really, really seriously questioning whether or not I was actually trans. My other motivation was laziness. I thought that becoming a trad wife for some incel, like some 4'8", like obese, probably severely autistic guy who just happened to have a lot of money, I thought that would be my future, becoming the girlfriend for someone like that, and then just doing whatever humiliating, disgusting things they would want me to do, because I thought that would make it to where I could be unemployed forever, and I would never have to work again if I did that. And I had this mindset about women at the time, where I thought, you know, why aren't all women doing something like that? Because men are extremely desperate. They will fuck anything that moves. Why are women not just constantly finding the most wealthy, ugly guys who will dedicate themselves to them forever if they can just get head? That was how I thought, because I had a particular narrative about how these things worked. Of course, I was wrong. I got into a situation like that myself, and I came to realize the reason why women are not doing this in mass numbers is because it is a deeply uncomfortable experience to have that is not pleasant in any way whatsoever, and any dividends you will get out of doing that mean nothing in the face of how bad it will make you feel. And so I had a renewed respect for the opposite sex after that, and a lot of my more unrealistic conceptions of that quickly dissipated. And so here I was, just completely and utterly miserable, continually trying to engage in this scheme as like a last-ditch effort to remain transgender, and it wasn't working very well. This was on top of the fact that I was terrified of having to come out to all of my friends as someone who detransitioned, because most of my friends were and are trans, and they were like cheering me on constantly. All the while, I was feeding them this narrative about myself that I had intricately crafted to support the story of me having gender dysphoria. I had cherry-picked all of the most dysphoric moments from my childhood and current time, and omitted all of the evidence to the contrary while putting them in this holistic narrative that sounded like a really good story that supported the notion that I was trans. And that makes me sound both Machiavellian towards those around me and towards myself, because it sounds like I'm trying to force myself to buy into a certain narrative. But it makes sense that I would do that. One, when I had those economic motivations that were motivated by desperation and a sense of hopelessness. And also, when I was surrounded by people who were essentially pressuring me into being someone who I was not, who felt completely and utterly sure that I was someone who I was not. And it was a big decision to make, to only turn around later and say, yeah, I changed my mind. Like, that's kind of a really uncomfortable thing to do. But by the time 2022 rolled around, and at the beginning of that year, the two relationships that I was in fell apart, horribly fell apart, like, in the worst possible way. It was just complete and utter chaos, and I knew that I was not going to have a guy that I could rely on who, you know, for sexual purposes or whatever, would want me to be transgender. I was just like, why don't I just do whatever I want to do? Like, if I don't want to take these hormones, and I don't like how they're making me feel, and I don't like being this person, and I don't like how that's making me feel, why don't I just stop? There's no economic motivation for me to keep doing this. There's no... I wanted to kill myself by that point, because I was so upset about those horrible relationships ending. And I was just like, well, if I want to do an actual suicide, why don't I just do a social suicide? Why don't I kill myself in terms of who I am to my friends, to those around me? And so that's what I did. I said that I'm detransitioning, I'm not transgender, and everyone around me, like, was in dismay, but they had to kill that old me that was in their heads in order to see who I actually was, which is who I'm talking about in this video. The masculine-leaning, non-binary person who doesn't conform to either gender particularly, like, also doesn't really care about gender at that. Like, I go by any, all pronouns. I prefer they, them, because I think there's more utility in it, but I don't fucking care what I'm called. It doesn't matter to me. And I am a lot happier identifying as non-binary or as male. Like, functionally speaking, I'm male. I'm just a gender non-conforming one who embraces the fact that they love trans women and that they want to fuck trans women. Instead of pretending to be a trans woman who, like, does all of this strange performative stuff. It was just a miserable ordeal that I was experiencing. And yeah, a lot of people aren't going to understand why I detransitioned. There's going to be pushback against it, like, forever. But you can't beat a lie with more lies. And the truth is, I lied to myself, but I also lied to you. And if I'm being entirely honest, I lied to you way more than I lied to myself. Because there was a point when I knew I was not trans, but I kept going on with it anyway. I kept trying to force myself into it, and that was not right for anybody. That wasn't right for my friends, that wasn't right for my viewers, or anyone around me. That was wrong to have deceived people in that way. I just hope that with everything laid out in this video, perhaps people can come to understand it, and if they don't, oh well. I'm just happy that now I can live as the person that I truly am. So I realized after recording and editing this video that I only really focus on gender as it pertains to my original arc, where I transitioned and then I detransitioned with that big video. There was actually an arc where I quote-unquote retransitioned that lasted like a month, and to be really just extra honest with you, I basically just did a lot of heroin during that time and was having some weird ideas about myself. I got obsessed with this idea of gender jouissance. Jouissance is this French term for like pure emotion or orgasm, and I was just having a lot of really weird thoughts at that time, and I made that big video where I was basically like, oh, I'm not gonna fundamentally restructure myself or do voice training or anything like that. I'm just gonna wear dresses sometimes and be exactly the same way as I currently am. Also, I identify as a woman now. That was basically the thesis of the video. Not me, not me at all, as I got into my relationship with my girlfriend, who is older than me and is transgender, someone who I am very intimate with, to put it lightly. Just seeing our dynamic and the way that we live together and the way that we spend time together, it became abundantly clear that I was not a woman, and that those were just some weird ideas that I had back when I used to use drugs. So, thanks to her and the very open and honest conversations that she and I had with each other, I kind of got to my senses and realized that I was experiencing a lot of hot air. I was like a hot air balloon, and by that I mean there was nothing in it. My gender was like an empty signifier, basically. Okay, so that was the other arc. The meat of this video focuses on the really long arc,